In the long, slow hemorrhage of history, one wound never properly closed. An event so immense in scale, so devastating in consequence. It is less a chapter of history and more a geological fault line running through centuries of human memory. This is not a tale of fallen empires or great men. It is a story of a continent hollowed out. This is the story of a cataclysm that did not come from foreign invaders or the march of armies, but from a microscopic stowaway on a merchant ship that slipped into a Sicilian harbor in 1347. This is the story of the Black Death, and why, despite everything you've been taught, its deepest truths are still hidden in the bone pits of Europe. How could a plague that killed at least 1 in every 3 people across a continent reshape not just bodies, but the very architecture of the human soul? And what have we chosen to forget because the reality is too terrifying to remember? To understand the hell that was about to break loose, you must first see the world that was lost. Europe in the mid-14th century was, in many ways, a civilization poised on a knife's edge of its own making. The High Middle Ages had witnessed a remarkable period of growth and expansion. Forests were cleared for farmland. Towns swelled into cities. Trade routes from the fabled Silk Road stretched from the markets of Constantinople to the docks of Venice and Genoa. The population had ballooned, perhaps to 80 million souls. But this growth was built on fragile foundations. The climate, after a period known as the medieval warm period, was turning against them. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, triggered by years of atrocious weather, had already killed millions and left deep scars of malnutrition and vulnerability. Society was rigidly hierarchical, a great chain of being ordained by God, with kings and popes at the top and a vast sea of peasants at the bottom, their lives short, hard, and tethered to the land they did not own. Faith was the universal lens. The Catholic Church was the supreme temporal and spiritual power, its cathedrals scraping the sky, its doctrine explaining everything from the movement of planets to the cause of disease. Illness was seen as divine punishment, a manifestation of sin, or the work of malevolent spiritual forces. Medicine, such as it was, operated on the theories of Galen and Hippocrates, focused on balancing the 4 bodily humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Bleeding, purging, and prayers were the primary tools against sickness. It was a world saturated in symbolism, where every event had a moral meaning, and where the invisible angels, demons, the will of God, was as real as the stone of a castle wall. Into this world, the pathogen arrived. We now know the Black Death was caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis. It existed in a natural reservoir among wild rodents, particularly the burrowing marmots of the Central Asian steppes. The mechanism of transmission was the humble flea, Xenicilla chiopes. When a flea bit an infected rat, the bacteria multiplied in its gut, forming a blockage. The starving, frantic flea would then leap to a new host, regurgitating bacteria-laden blood into the bite wound with each attempt to feed. From rats to other rats, and eventually to humans. The disease manifested in 3 horrific forms: bubonic, characterized by grotesquely swollen lymph nodes, called buboes in the groin, armpit, or neck; pneumonic, which attacked the lungs and could spread directly from person to person through airborne droplets, with near 100% mortality; and septicemic, where the bacteria invaded the bloodstream, causing rapid systemic collapse; and dark, gangrenous patches on the skin, the black in Black Death. But in 1347, none of this was known. All Europe knew was that a storm of death was coming from the east. The point of entry is traditionally placed at the fortified Genoese trading port of Kaffa, on the Crimean coast of the Black Sea. In 1346, a Mongol army under Yanni Beg was besieging the city. Plague broke out in the Mongol camp. In one of history's first recorded acts of biological warfare, Yanni Beg is said to have ordered the corpses of his dead to be catapulted over the walls into the city. Whether this gruesome tactic worked or the rats and fleas simply found their own way through the defenses, plague took hold in Kaffa. The panicked Genoese merchants and sailors fled in their galleys, carrying their invisible passengers with them. By October 1347, 12 of these death ships had arrived at the port of Messina in Sicily. The chronicler Gabriel de Musis, a notary from Piacenza, described the scene. The sailors brought in their bones a disease so violent that whoever spoke a word to them was infected and could in no way save himself from death. The sick had a mysterious disease which manifested itself by boils in the thighs and arms, and boils which grew to the size of a common apple or an egg. The terrified Sicilians drove the ships back out to sea, but it was too late. Rats scurried down the mooring ropes. Infected fleas hopped onto the docks. The pandemic had breached Europe's shores. From Sicily, it was a wildfire with the wind at its back. It reached Genoa and Venice by January 1348, Marseille by February. It traveled not just by ship along the bustling Mediterranean trade lanes, but overland, following pilgrimage routes, merchant caravan trails, and the paths of armies. It moved with terrifying speed, averaging 2 to 3 miles per day, faster along coasts and rivers. By the spring of 1348, it was in Paris. By summer, it had crossed the Channel to England, landing at the port of Melcombe Regis in Dorset. Then the dreadful pestilence made its way along the coast by Southampton and reached Bristol, wrote the monk Henry Knighton, where almost the whole strength of the town perished, as if it had been seized by sudden death, for there were few who kept their beds for more than 2 or 3 days, or even half a day. The physical experience of the plague was a descent into a uniquely personal hell. The onset was often sudden. A person could feel perfectly healthy in the morning and be shivering with fever by noon. The classic bubonic form began with fever, chills, headache, and profound weakness. Then the buboes appeared, hard, painful, egg-sized swellings that turned the skin a livid purple-black. They were excruciatingly tender. The Italian writer Giovanni Boccaccio, who witnessed the plague in Florence and later immortalized it in the Decameron, wrote, "In men and women alike it first betrayed itself by the emergence of certain tumors in the groin or armpits, some of which grew as large as a common apple, others as an egg. From these 2 parts of the body, this deadly gavacciolo soon began to propagate and spread itself in all directions indifferently. Death usually followed within 3 to 5 days. But there were faster, more terrifying paths. The pneumonic plague attacked the respiratory system, causing coughing, chest pain, and the coughing up of bloody, frothy sputum. Victims drowned in their own fluids, often dying within 24 hours. The septicemic plague was a swift, dark shadow. It caused massive internal bleeding, turning the skin black with subcutaneous hemorrhages, the origin of the name Black Death. It could kill in mere hours, sometimes before buboes even had time to form. The plague did not just take lives. It performed a cruel, accelerated pantomime of the entire process of decay on the living body. The numbers are so vast they defy human comprehension. Modern estimates, based on manorial records, tax rolls, and monastic chronicles, suggest a mortality rate of 40 to 60% across Europe. Out of a pre-plague population of around 80 million, at least 30 to 50 million people died between 1347 and 1351. Some areas were utterly annihilated. In Siena, Italy, the chronicler Agnolo di Tura buried his 5 children with his own hands. He wrote, "So many died that all believed it was the end of the world. And I, Agnolo di Tura, called the Fat, buried my 5 children with my own hands." He noted that Siena's great cathedral expansion, one of the most ambitious in Europe, was halted forever for lack of workers and will. And no one could be found to carry the stones, he lamented. The scale of death overwhelmed every social structure. Boccaccio described the scene in Florence. Such was the multitude of corpses brought to the churches every day and almost every hour that there was not enough consecrated ground to bury them. Graves were dug in great pits, fosse communes, where layers of bodies were stacked like cordwood, sprinkled with a thin layer of dirt, and another layer added. Archaeological excavations of these plague pits reveal the horrifying reality. Bodies thrown in haphazardly, without coffins, often still clothed. Families jumbled together in a final, anonymous embrace. In London, the emergency cemetery at East Smithfield received over 2,400 bodies in a matter of months. The Bishop of Bath and Wells in England issued a desperate directive in January 1349, The contagious nature of the present pestilence, which is spreading everywhere, leaves us no choice but to allow corpses to be buried in common graves in churchyards or in cemeteries. But the crisis was not just one of burial. It was a complete collapse of the normal order. As death reaped its harvest, society began to unravel at the seams. The first and most immediate casualty was care. Doctors, operating on useless humoral theories, were powerless. They wore bizarre beak masks filled with aromatic herbs thought to ward off miasma, bad air, a haunting and futile image. They fled, or they died. Priests, whose duty was to administer last rites, found themselves facing a horrifying dilemma. To perform the sacrament was to guarantee exposure. Many abandoned their posts. Many more died. The chronicler William of Dean in Rochester wrote, "The priest who confessed the sick and those who carried the dead to burial were immediately overcome by death, so that some parishes remained altogether without a priest." The bonds of family, the most fundamental human unit, were stretched to the breaking point and often snapped. Boccaccio painted the most vivid and devastating picture of this social dissolution. One citizen avoided another. Even kinsfolk held aloof. Brother was forsaken by brother, nephew by uncle, brother by sister, and oftentimes husband by wife. Nay, what is more, and scarcely to be believed, fathers and mothers were found to abandon their own children to their fate, untended, unvisited, as if they had been strangers. The instinct for self-preservation overrode the deepest social imperatives. The streets fell silent, but for the occasional cry of the sick or the steady rumble of death carts, the beccini, whose drivers, often coarse men paid exorbitant sums, would call out, "Bring out your dead." Law and order evaporated. Courts closed. Markets ceased. Fields lay fallow as the peasants who worked them died. With so many dead, the price of everything inverted. Luxuries became cheap as the wealthy died and their goods flooded the market. Necessities, especially labor, became astronomically expensive. A horse that cost 40 shillings before the plague might fetch only 6 shillings after. But the wages for a plowman or a thatcher could triple or quadruple. The fundamental economic equation of medieval Europe, land was wealth, labor was cheap, had been turned upside down overnight. In this vacuum of authority and meaning, humanity's darker impulses flourished alongside its nobler ones. Some, believing the end was truly nigh, plunged into hedonistic despair. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die, became a lived philosophy for some. Boccaccio wrote of people who maintained that to drink freely, frequent places of public resort, and take their pleasure with song and revel, sparing to satisfy no appetite, and to laugh and mock at no event, was the sovereign remedy for so great an evil. Others ran in the opposite direction, toward extreme piety. Flagellant movements arose, particularly in Germany. Groups of men, sometimes 100 strong, would march from town to town, stripped to the waist, publicly whipping themselves with scourges tipped with metal spikes until their backs ran with blood. They believed this extreme penance could appease God's wrath and halt the plague. They were often millenarian, preaching the end times and challenging the authority of the church itself, which eventually condemned them as heretics. And then, as always in times of overwhelming, inexplicable catastrophe, the search for a scapegoat began. The wrath of God needed a human agent. Rumors spread that Jews, as non-Christians, were poisoning wells to destroy Christendom. Despite papal bulls condemning the persecution and the obvious fact that Jews died from the plague at the same horrific rates as everyone else, pogroms erupted with systematic fury. In February 1349, the entire Jewish community of Strasbourg, several hundred men, women, and children, were burned alive on a wooden platform in the city's Jewish cemetery. Their property was confiscated by the city council. Similar massacres occurred in Mainz, Cologne, Frankfurt, and Barcelona. It was a paroxysm of hatred born from sheer terror, a desperate attempt to impose a narrative of human conspiracy on a catastrophe that was utterly indifferent. For those who lived through it, the psychological trauma was immeasurable. The world had not just become dangerous, it had become senseless. The core medieval belief in a divinely ordered, purposeful universe was shattered. Why did the pious priest die while the town drunk survived? Why did a loving mother succumb while her neglectful neighbor was spared? The plague was random, democratic in its cruelty. It killed saints and sinners, kings and paupers, the young and strong alongside the old and weak. This randomness was perhaps its most spiritually destructive feature. The chronicler Jean de Venette in Paris expressed this cosmic confusion. The plague, it was said, had spared no one. Yet it was observed that it more frequently attacked and carried off the meaner common people, and rarely the great. But the contrary was seen to be true in many places. God alone knew why. After the first devastating wave of 1347 to 1351, the plague did not disappear. It became endemic, returning in waves every 5 to 12 years for the rest of the 14th century, and well into the 15th, the second plague, pandemic. Each return, like the plague of 1361 to 62, the pestis secunda, or children's plague, that targeted the younger, non-immune population born since the first wave, and 1369, killed another 10 to 20% of the survivors, preventing population recovery and keeping society in a state of perpetual shock and mourning. Death became a constant, familiar companion. But to view the Black Death solely as an agent of destruction is to miss half of its story, the half that shaped the modern world. The catastrophe acted as a brutal, irresistible force of change, shattering the old medieval order and creating the conditions for something new to emerge. This is where the hidden legacy lies, not just in the graves, but in the cracks that opened in the bedrock of society. The most immediate and transformative effect was economic and social. With perhaps half the labor force dead, the survivors found themselves in a position of unprecedented power. The peasant, once a serf bound to his lord's land, could now demand wages. If one lord wouldn't pay, another would, desperate for hands to work his fields. The feudal system, built on a pyramid of obligations with cheap labor at its base, began to crumble. In England, the ruling class panicked. They tried to freeze wages and force peasants back into serfdom with the Statute of Laborers in 1351. It was unenforceable. The economic reality was a new one. Labor was scarce and therefore valuable. This simmering tension exploded in 1381 with the Peasants' Revolt in England. Rebels, led by Wat Tyler and the radical priest John Ball, marched on London. Ball's famous question, preached from village pulpits, captured the new spirit. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? The revolt was brutally crushed, but the genie could not be put back in the bottle. The old certainties of the great chain of being were broken. While feudalism did not vanish overnight, its erosion accelerated dramatically. A more mobile, wage-based economy began to take shape, paving the way for the capitalism of early modern Europe. The plague also triggered a massive redistribution of wealth. With entire families wiped out, lands and fortunes consolidated in the hands of fewer, often distant, heirs. A new class of wealthy merchants and skilled artisans emerged, their status based on movable wealth rather than inherited land. This contributed to the rise of a more independent, self-confident urban middle class. The authority of the Catholic Church, the very bedrock of medieval life, suffered a devastating blow. The Church had failed as a protector. Its prayers had not stopped the plague. Its priests had fled or died. Its explanation, divine punishment for sin, rang hollow when the most virtuous seemed as vulnerable as the most wicked. The spectacle of the Church selling indulgences, pardons for sin, to fund itself in the aftermath only deepened the cynicism. Dissent and questioning grew. Movements like John Wycliffe's Lollards in England, who translated the Bible into English and criticized church corruption, gained traction. This crisis of faith was a direct prelude to the Protestant Reformation a century and a half later. The unquestioned spiritual monopoly of Rome was over. The field of medicine, though still primitive, was forced to change. The utter failure of Galenic humoral theory in the face of the plague created a crisis in the field. While true germ theory was centuries away, the experience led to more pragmatic approaches. The concept of quarantine was born in Venice in 1348, with ships forced to wait at anchor for 40 days, 40 giorni, before landing. Public health measures, however rudimentary, began to be systematized in Italian city-states. The plague also shattered the physicians' monopoly on healing, opening the door for surgeons and apothecaries to gain status. Perhaps the most profound, yet subtle, changes were cultural and psychological. The omnipresence of death gave rise to a new artistic motif, the danse macabre, or dance of death. In murals, poems, and plays, death was personified as a skeleton leading people from all walks of life, pope, emperor, king, peasant, child, in a final, egalitarian dance. It was a memento mori on a societal scale, a constant reminder of the fragility of life and the vanity of worldly status. This obsession with mortality also manifested in more realistic, often gruesome, depictions of the dead and the suffering Christ in art, emphasizing human pain and physicality. Literature, too, was transformed. The framework of Boccaccio's Decameron is the plague itself. 10 young nobles flee Florence for a country villa and tell stories to pass the time. The book is a vibrant, often earthy, celebration of life, wit, and human cunning, but it is framed by the abyss. Geoffrey Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales, written a generation later, reflects the new social mobility and diversity of voices post-plague. The worldly wife of Bath, the sharp-tongued miller, the corrupt pardoner, all on a pilgrimage, a journey born from the penitential atmosphere the plague helped create. On a deeper, cognitive level, some historians argue the trauma altered the European psyche. The sheer scale of loss may have accelerated a shift toward a more individualistic, inward-focused worldview. When family and community could vanish overnight, one's personal relationship with God and one's own survival instincts became paramount. This could have fed into the Renaissance emphasis on individual achievement and the exploration of the self. Yet, for all these seismic shifts, the Black Death also left deep scars of trauma that inhibited progress. The repeated returns of the plague created a climate of fear and insecurity that lasted for generations. Population levels in Europe did not recover to pre-1347 levels until the 16th century. This demographic stagnation meant less pressure on resources, but also less dynamism, less need for innovation in agriculture or industry for a time. The obsession with death and divine punishment could foster pessimism and religious intolerance as easily as it could spur a cherish for life. The plague's journey was not confined to Europe. It ravaged the Middle East, North Africa, and Asia with similar ferocity. The Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt lost perhaps 40% of its population. The Ilkhanate in Persia collapsed. In China, which had already suffered devastating epidemics in the 1330s, possibly connected to the same pandemic, the plague contributed to the turmoil that ended the Mongol-led Yuan dynasty and ushered in the Ming. The Black Death was a genuinely global event, a grim connecting thread across continents in a world that was becoming, tragically, more interconnected. Why then is our understanding of the Black Death so often sanitized, reduced to a statistic or a backdrop for tales of flagellants and plague doctors? Why do we not sit with the full, suffocating weight of it? Perhaps because the scale is genuinely incomprehensible. The death of 50 million people over 5 years is a number. The death of a mother abandoning her child, of a priest denying last rites, of a city where the only sound is the dragging of corpses. These are human experiences we can almost touch, and from which we instinctively recoil. The Black Death exposes the absolute fragility of civilization, the terrifying speed with which the bonds of society, care, law, faith, love, can dissolve under the right kind of pressure. It shows us that the distance between order and chaos, between a bustling market and a mass grave, is shorter than we dare believe. Furthermore, the plague forces us to confront the randomness of existence. It offers no redemption narrative, no clear lesson except that of vulnerability. It wasn't a war with heroes and villains. It was an ecological accident with apocalyptic consequences. That is a harder story to tell and a more frightening truth to hold. Modern science has given us the tools to understand the how of the Black Death. DNA analysis of bacteria from plague pits has confirmed Yersinia pestis as the culprit. We understand the rat-flea-human transmission cycle. We have antibiotics that can treat it. But science cannot answer the why of the human response, nor can it fully measure the shadow it cast across centuries. That shadow lingers in our language: plague, pestilence, a fate worse than death. It lingers in our collective nightmares of pandemics, a deep-seated cultural memory of a time when the air itself could kill. The legacy of the Black Death is a paradox. It was one of the worst catastrophes in human history, an almost unimaginable concentration of suffering. Yet, from that furnace, key elements of the modern world were forged: the breakdown of feudalism, the weakening of monolithic religious authority, the seeds of public health, a new focus on the individual and the material world. It was, in the darkest possible sense, a creative destruction. But to view it solely as a catalyst for progress is to commit a grave injustice to the dead. It risks turning 50 million souls into a mere historical pivot point. Their suffering was not a means to an end. It was an end in itself, a vast, silent scream that echoed across a continent. As we face our own global crises, pandemics, climate change, the Black Death offers no easy parallels, but it offers stark warnings. It shows how quickly misinformation and scapegoating can fill an explanatory vacuum. It demonstrates the critical importance of robust, trusted institutions for care and social cohesion. It reveals both the breathtaking cruelty and the profound courage of which humans are capable when the world falls apart. Most of all, it reminds us that history is not just about the powerful, but about the countless ordinary people who bear the brunt of its storms, whose names are lost to the pits, but whose collective experience shapes everything that comes after. The greatest plagues are not just measured in bodies, but in the shattered assumptions they leave behind. The story of the Black Death is ultimately not a story about a bacterium. It is a story about us. About what happens when the world stops making sense. About what we abandon and what we cling to when the lights go out. The silence that fell over Europe in 1351 was not just an absence of sound. It was the silence of a world holding its breath, traumatized, forever altered, waiting to see what would grow in the soil fertilized by so much death. If this deep, unsettling journey into one of history's foundational cataclysms has held you, support the channel's mission to unearth these difficult truths. Give this video a like and continue to explore the profound echoes of the past with us here on Winds of Thought. To truly grasp the totality of the Black Death, we must pull the camera back further, to a planetary scale. The 14th century pandemic was not a European event that touched others. It was a hemispheric cataclysm with its epicenter in the ecological cradle of Central Asia. The steppes, that vast sea of grass stretching from the Black Sea to Manchuria, have long been an engine of both human migration and disease diffusion. The Mongol Empire of the 13th and 14th centuries, the largest contiguous land empire in history, acted as the ultimate transmission belt. By securing the Silk Road under a single brutal authority, the Pax Mongolica, they did not just facilitate the flow of silk, spices, and ideas. They created a superhighway for pathogens. For the first time, a germ could travel from the hinterlands of China to the shores of the Black Sea in a matter of months, carried by traders, soldiers, and the endless caravan of rodents that lived in symbiosis with human movement. Recent archaeological genetics has revolutionized our understanding. Teeth and bone samples from plague pits across Eurasia have yielded the genome of Yersinia pestis. The story written in that DNA is one of evolution and travel. The strain that caused the Black Death likely evolved from an older ancestor in the Tian Shan Mountains or the Qing-Haidebet Plateau around the early 14th century. It acquired key genetic mutations that increased its virulence and its ability to survive in fleas. Then it began its march. By the 1330s, it was causing havoc in China. The Chinese chronicles of the Yuan dynasty report devastating epidemics. One record from Hubei province states, 9 out of 10 families were struck by the disease, and in many houses there were none left to mourn the dead. From China, it moved west with the caravans. It devastated the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia. It hit the Golden Horde, the Mongol Khanate ruling the Russian steppes, which is where the besieging army at Kaffa contracted it. But it also moved south. It tore through the Ilkhanate in Persia. The great Persian historian and vizier Rashid al-Din, though he died just before the plague's arrival, described earlier pestilences, but his successors recorded the devastation. In cities like Baghdad and Tabriz, death rates mirrored those in Europe. The Arabic term for the plague, al-Tan, appears in countless chronicles with the same litany of horror: abandoned cities, collapsing trade, piles of corpses. In the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt and Syria, the plague arrived in 1347 via Alexandria. The Egyptian historian al-Makrizi left a harrowing account of Cairo. The number of deaths in Cairo and Old Cairo rose to 900,000. The catastrophe was so great that all institutions ceased functioning. The Sultan's palace was empty of guards and servants. The markets were closed. People grew accustomed to the constant presence of death. The plague ravaged the agricultural heartland of the Nile Delta, leading to famine and a permanent weakening of the Mamluk state. This global perspective shatters any notion of European exceptionalism in suffering. The plague was an equal opportunity destroyer. However, the responses and the long-term consequences differed dramatically, and this is where the hidden contours of world history were shaped. In the Islamic world, the theological and intellectual response was notably different. While also seen as a mercy or punishment from God, Shaheed for the believer, Islamic medicine, influenced by scholars like Ibn Sina, Avicenna, had a stronger tradition of empirical observation and contagion theory. Though the germ theory was unknown, the concept of transmission through proximity was more readily accepted. Some religious authorities endorsed flight from infected areas, citing a saying, hadith, of the Prophet Muhammad about fleeing from leprosy. Quarantine practices were also adopted, though sometimes in tension with religious obligations for communal prayer and burial. The demographic collapse in the Middle East, coming on the heels of Mongol invasions, contributed to a long period of economic and cultural retrenchment, altering the balance of power between the Islamic heartland and the rising powers on its periphery, notably the Ottoman Turks. In Europe, the fragmentation of political authority meant the response was patchwork, city by city, kingdom by kingdom. In the unified bureaucratic empire of China under the Ming, which overthrew the plague-weakened Yuan in 1368, the state response could be more systematic, if not more effective. The Ming founder, the Hanwu Emperor, instituted massive population transfers from heavily affected regions to depopulated ones, and his administration produced detailed medical tracts on epidemic disease. However, the psychological and cultural impact in China was similarly profound, contributing to a turn inward and a suspicion of the foreign, which would characterize early Ming policy. The plague also had a catastrophic impact on the Byzantine Empire, that old bastion of Roman civilization centered on Constantinople. Already shrunken and weakened by centuries of conflict, the empire was dealt a death blow. The plague ravaged its capital and its few remaining provinces. It crippled tax revenues and military recruitment. When the Ottoman Turks finally besieged and conquered Constantinople in 1453, they were attacking a ghost of a city, its population a fraction of its former glory, its strength sapped by a century of recurring plague. The Black Death helped clear the stage for the rise of the Ottoman Empire as the new dominant power in the Eastern Mediterranean. Beyond the macro-historical shifts, the micro-historical experience, the lived reality of daily life during the plague years, reveals a tapestry of human behavior under unimaginable stress. Let's delve deeper into spaces often overlooked. Consider the monastery and the convent. These closed religious communities, intended to be fortresses of prayer and separation from the world, became deadly traps. Their communal living, shared dormitories, refectories, and latrines made them perfect incubators. The mortality rate among monks and nuns was often staggeringly high, sometimes exceeding 80%. The Chronicle of the Monastery of Rochester in England simply lists name after name under the heading "Here Died." The spiritual crisis was acute inside these walls. If those dedicated solely to God could not be spared, what hope was there? The mass death of literate monks also contributed to a temporary decline in learning and manuscript production, a dark age within the dark ages. Consider the experience of children. They died in vast numbers. But for those who survived, what world did they inherit? They grew up in a society dominated by ghosts. They were raised by grieving parents, or by no parents at all, becoming wards of the manor or the town. They inherited property and responsibilities far beyond their years. A boy of 10 might find himself the heir to a farm. A girl of 12 might be a sought-after bride due to the dowry she unexpectedly inherited. This created a generation forced into premature adulthood, wielding economic power they were not prepared for, living with a psychological inheritance of loss that we can scarcely imagine. The Children's Plague of 1361, which disproportionately killed the young post-plague generation, added another layer of trauma, making survival feel like a cruel lottery. Consider the material world. With so many dead, the landscape itself changed. Villages were abandoned, their names later prefixed with deserted or lost on maps. Fields reverted to forest and scrub. In England, the process of enclosure, turning common farmland into private pasture for more profitable sheep, was accelerated by the labor shortage. This created landscapes that are still visible today. The rolling, hedgeless downs of southern England, the empty valleys of the Yorkshire Dales, where only the foundations of houses remain. The built environment also changed. The frantic cathedral building of the 13th century ceased. Instead, wealthy survivors often invested in smaller, more personal monuments. Chantry chapels where priests would say masses for their souls, elaborately carved tombs depicting not serene saints, but rotting corpses, transi tombs, as a stark memento mori. The plague also catalyzed technological innovation, albeit in grim ways. The demand for speed in burial led to improvements in cart design. The need to process vast quantities of wills and inheritance disputes spurred developments in legal documentation and the notarial profession. The labor shortage provided a powerful incentive for labor-saving devices. While the full flowering of this would come later, the seeds for the water-powered blast furnace, the spinning wheel, and other late medieval technologies were sown in a world where human muscle was suddenly a scarce commodity. Language and literature were indelibly marked. The English language itself was transformed. Before the plague, French was the language of the English court and nobility, Latin of the church and scholarship. English was the tongue of the common people. But the plague killed a disproportionate number of the Latin-speaking clergy and disrupted the Norman-derived aristocracy. In the aftermath, English began its ascendancy. The works of Chaucer and Wycliffe's Bible in English were products of this linguistic shift. The plague, in a roundabout way, helped forge a national vernacular identity. The pandemic also left a deep imprint on folklore and collective memory. The figure of the Pied Piper of Hamelin, first recorded in a stained glass window from around the plague era, is often interpreted as an allegory for the plague stealing the town's children. Nursery rhymes like "Ring a Ring o' Roses" are popularly, if debatably, linked to plague symptoms. These cultural artifacts are the psychological scar tissue of a traumatized civilization, ways of encoding and managing an unbearable memory across generations. Science, in its long march, eventually caught up with the horror. The third plague pandemic, which began in China's Yunnan province in the 1850s and spread globally by steamship, finally allowed scientists to identify the causative agent. In 1894, during an outbreak in Hong Kong, the bacteriologist Alexander Yersin, for whom the bacterium is named, and Kitasato Shibasaburo independently discovered Yersinia pestis. The rat-flea transmission cycle was soon elucidated. This understanding, coupled with the development of antibiotics like streptomycin in the 20th century, finally tamed the disease as a mass killer, though it has never been eradicated. Today, the Black Death stands as the benchmark against which all pandemics are measured. Its shadow lengthens during our own outbreaks. The COVID-19 pandemic, for all its global disruption and tragic loss of life, provided a faint echo, enough to make the medieval experience feel less alien. The empty streets, the fear of strangers, the economic shock, the scramble for explanations, the political mismanagement, the disproportionate impact on the poor and marginalized, the explosion of misinformation, all were present in the 14th century, magnified 1,000-fold by a far deadlier pathogen, and a world with no scientific framework to understand it. This brings us to the final haunting question. Could it happen again? Yersinia pestis still exists in rodent reservoirs around the world, including the western United States. Cases of bubonic plague still occur, though they are treatable with antibiotics. The risk of a major pandemic on the scale of the Black Death is low due to our medical knowledge, public health infrastructure, and antibiotics. However, the bacterium's DNA shows it has not lost its potency. The threat of antibiotic resistance is real. And the conditions of our modern world, dense urban populations, rapid global travel, ecological disruption that pushes wildlife and their diseases into closer contact with humans, mean that the potential for a novel pathogen to cause similar societal disruption remains. The Black Death is not a relic, it is a case study, the ultimate stress test of human society. What, then, is the ultimate lesson of the Black Death? It is not a single lesson, but a constellation of terrible truths. First, it teaches the profound interdependence of human and natural history. The pandemic was not a historical event in a vacuum. It was an ecological phenomenon, the spillover of a zoonotic disease supercharged by human patterns of trade, war, and settlement. History and biology are inextricably linked. Second, it reveals the dual nature of human resilience. We see the capacity for abject cowardice, cruelty, and superstition. But we also see extraordinary courage. The unknown good people in Boccaccio's Decameron who tended the sick and buried the dead at great personal risk. The communities that struggled to maintain some semblance of order. The artists and writers who tried to make sense of the senseless. Catastrophe does not reveal who we truly are so much as it expands the range of what we can become, for better and for worse. Third, it demonstrates that the greatest historical transformations are often born not from triumph, but from trauma. The Renaissance, the Reformation, the rise of the modern state, the beginnings of capitalism, all were gestated in the grim aftermath of the plague. This is not to justify the suffering, but to recognize that history's path is often carved by catastrophe. Finally, and most importantly, the Black Death forces a humbling perspective. In the face of a microscopic organism, the edifice of medieval civilization, its faith, its social order, its economic systems, proved terrifyingly fragile. It reminds us that our own complex global civilization, for all its technology and knowledge, rests on similar, fragile foundations. A mutation in a virus, a shift in the climate, can still expose our vulnerabilities. The story of the Black Death is the story of a before and an after. It is the story of the world we lost and the uncertain world we gained. It is written in the silent archaeology of plague pits, in the changed trajectories of economies, in the altered tones of art and faith, and in the deep, collective memory of a trauma that shaped the Western mind. To study, it is not to dwell on morbidity,